7. When I look back upon all these years that have gone by, I realize that the bhakti and belief I had in God has changed in a curious way. I am myself surprised by this. When I lived at home as a child, the people who taught me about devotion to God were my mother, Patti, my teachers and the nuns, and later on, the priests. I believed entirely in what they told me. I prayed exactly as I was taught. There were catechism classes every evening at church. After school was done, within a short while, we would cover our heads with a piece of cloth and set off to the church. Sometimes we'd be ravenously hungry. We'd long for something to munch as we walked along our way. Sometimes we would soak a little broken rice and carry that in our clothes or shirt pockets and munch on that. On our way we'd see all sorts of things being sold at the bazaar by the oil press. But we never had any money. So we'd stand and watch a while and then move on. In the morning, dew or rain, we had to rise at dawn and go to morning pasai. We'd clean our teeth in a haphazard way, fling a piece of cloth over our heads and run. It was at cock crow, somehow, that you were most deeply asleep. Yet it was at that hour we had to wake up and run. It used to be a torment just to get up. We'd scarcely wash our faces and make haste. When the lake was swollen with water, it was near impossible to go. It was usually very cold then. However much you were shaken awake, all you wanted to do was to turn over and go to sleep, you just couldn't bear to get up. But really there was nothing else for it, however hard you resisted, you just had to go. If you didn't go the next day at assembly you were beaten by the priest or by a teacher. Nor were these ordinary blows. The cane fell on us with the sharpness of a whip. It left great wheals. Enough to be reminded of those blows. Then we'd spring out of our beds at last. From the time I was a child, I found it easy to learn by rote. I also found I had a good memory. So I was always in good form in the catechism class. Whenever there was a test on the scriptures, I always won the first prize. When I was studying in the second class, a priest who was a white man came to visit our school. He was of a good height, and had a long, brilliantly white beard. All of us were curious just to touch him. The sister asked each of us to repeat various prayers. She asked us to repeat the 6 perfections of God, the Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, and the Creed. I was the only one there who could say all of them correctly. The priest lifted me up and kissed me, and gave me a 5 paisa piece. I was pleased first of all that the priest touched me and lifted me up. That he should have kissed me. And even given me the money filled me with an incomparable joy. I took the coin and tucked it away carefully in my skirt. I wanted to show them at home. That's why I made my first communion while I was still in the second class. When I was in the third, the Bishop of Madurai came to our village. I was confirmed then. When I went to study at the primary school run by nuns, the sisters entrusted me to lock up and to open the parish church. I would do all such jobs as going to the church and bringing the vases over at school time, polishing them, and then putting them back after the sisters had arranged them with flowers. I always took one of the other children with me. Because I was frightened to go inside the church by myself, I felt a bit braver if there was someone with me. If ever I had to stay alone in the church, my insides would quake. Because just at those times I would remember the stories that the sisters had told us in scripture lessons about the devil. They had told us that if we kept on committing sins, the devil would put them all down in a long list written into a big notebook, which he would show to God. Sister said in the scripture lesson that if we committed so many sins that the notebook actually filled up, then he would peel the skin off our backs and write our sins there. I would recall this always at the precise moment when I was alone in the church. I imagined the devil busily writing down my sins, and when the notebook was completely full, coming towards me to rip the skin off my back. I would see very clearly and within my vision, the dark devil that I had been shown in pictures, with a long tail, and with sharp horns, nails and teeth, coming towards me to show me the notebook in which my sins were written down. I would die of fear then. But usually I forgot about it when I left the church and came outside. The nuns never seemed to tell us any cheerful stories. It was always stories of the devil. They told us about the devil wandering about with a pair of balances, with the sins we had committed in one pan, weighed against the merit we had earned in the other. Every time I went near the church, I would be stupefied with terror, imagining the devil with his balance yelling above my head. I could actually see my load of sins pulling the pan downwards. In order to bring down my pan of good deeds, I did everything that the sisters told me to do. I obeyed them in all things. I repeated my prayers very often. But in spite of all this, my pan of sins continued to be the heavier one. They said you could actually see the devil with your own eyes. That is what really scared me. We used to imagine the devil to be exactly like the creature in the advertisement of Onita TV, only the real devil would be even more terrifying to look at, we thought, black as the night. I'd be shaken to the core at the very thought. The sisters told us that if we sinned greatly, it delighted the devil and made our guardian angel very sad. So if ever I told a small lie, if I pinched a stick or pencil, if at home I didn't obey my parents or elders, if I wasn't good at school, I'd see in front of my eyes the devil wandering about with his balances, laughing happily, and my guardian angel wretched and weeping. I too would want to weep then. However much I wanted to forget the scene, or to wipe it out, I could not. It just appeared before my eyes the more intensely. Before I made my first communion, they taught me most carefully about making my confession. For many days I simply repeated what they taught me to confess. Every week I went to the confession box, knelt down and reeled off the formula I had learnt by heart. I praise the Lord omnipotent. Bless me Sami, for I have sinned. It is a week since I made my last confession. I lied 4 times, I stole 5 times, I have not obeyed my elders, I was daydreaming in church. I repent these and those sins that I have forgotten, Sami. This was always the formula. The priest would tell me to say 3 Hail Marys as my punishment, and give me a blessing out loud. We had to get up from our knees, go into the church and complete our penances immediately. It was always scary to leave the priest's bungalow and enter the darkness of the church. Every time I finished my confession, I would set off for the church. Trembling and at a half run. We'd repeat the prayers that the priest had asked us to say, end with an act of contrition, and then run home. When we received the host at communion, we were not supposed to touch it either with our teeth or our fingers. The sisters had warned us that even if it stuck to our palates, we should only move it gently with our tongues and swallow it. The sisters had told us over and over again that Jesus was inside that host, we should not bite him, nor should we touch the host with our sinful hands. For some time I did as they told me. It was very embarrassing when it got stuck to my palate. Often it was difficult to shift it gently with my tongue. It also took an age to do this. I always worried about how I would manage to say the appropriate prayers after Holy Communion. So I always tried very hard to swallow it down somehow. It was very funny, actually. I would have to hide my mouth behind my headcloth, and then scrape my tongue against my palate, pushing my head to one side with the effort, and somehow manage to shift it in that way. At the same time I had to keep watching from the corner of my eye in case anyone observed my antics, particularly, of course, the sisters. For a long time, I had a perverse wish to try touching the host with my finger. So one day, hiding myself well behind my headcloth, I managed it at last. And it didn't happen at all as the nuns had threatened. They had said that if I touched it, blood would flow down my hand. I removed my finger and examined it. Nothing. I told myself that the sisters had spoken empty words. But I couldn't say that to anyone else. I did want to. But I was afraid that if I did so, it would be common knowledge that I had touched the host willfully. So I didn't say anything then. It seems that in some village or the other, one lad had bitten into the host with his teeth. From that very moment that morning, blood streamed from his mouth. It didn't stop throughout the day, the sisters told us this story too. I wanted to test that out too, so another time I put my headcloth against my mouth, and terrified by what I was doing. Bit, chewed and swallowed. I wiped my mouth with my cloth. And looked at it. No blood at all. Then I knew that this too had been an empty threat by the sisters. I couldn't tell anyone about this either. So it was in this way that I grew up in devotion and belief. When I was in the 3rd class, I was confirmed. They had told me that during the confirmation service, the bishop would slap my cheek. They said that it was at that moment that the Spiritus Sanctus would descend upon me. As the bishop neared me, I kept opening and shutting my eyes in expectation of the slap, so when he caught me a blow upon my cheek, I wasn't aware of any Spiritus Sanctus descending. Still, I kept my head bowed in devotion. I still want to laugh when I remember this. When I started going to the convent school, I belonged to the Baler Sabai, the Holy Childhood movement. On Sundays, we pinned on our Baler Sabai badges before attending Pasai. We were hugely proud of these badges. Then, after Pasai, there was a special service for the Baler Sabai. There used to be a Baler Sabai day once a year. Then you had to contribute money every now and then for something or the other. That's the thing I remember most. There was usually a catechism class on Sunday evenings. When that was over, there was the blessing in the church. This blessing would seemingly go on for hours and hours. The priest would come, give his sermon, and ask any number of questions as time went on and on. We small children would be so sleepy, we could scarcely keep our eyes open. If your eyes drooped even in the slightest, the sister sitting nearby would land a stinging blow on your back. Though we tried to keep our eyes open in fear of that blow, in a short while it would be impossible. One by one we'd drop onto the floor. As we grew a little older, the sisters stopped beating us. But they'd give us a sharp pinch. That hurt even more. They seemed to grow their nails for the sole purpose of pinching us. The trouble was that just a little after we had been given a sharp nip, our heads would start nodding again. Sometimes when the priest saw this happening, he would ask the sisters to slap us. Who should we have feared the most? It seemed impossible to control our urge to sleep. Once when I was dozing off like this and the sister slapped me, I was so startled that I wet myself. She gave me a few extra blows for that. I screamed out so loudly that my mother came, cleaned me up and carried me away. Because I was good at reciting the litany, the sisters made me teach the appropriate prayers to the girls who were preparing to get married. A catechist gave lessons to the prospective grooms at the church. After I had taught them for 2 or 3 weeks, the sister would come and test the girls. If they could not say the prayers properly, it was I who got the scolding. One day, when I was repeating the prayers, sister turned up suddenly. I was so startled by this, and became so nervous that I made a mistake and changed a line that I was saying out loud. Almost the first thing that she did when she came right inside was to give me a knock on my forehead. I happen to have a big, wide forehead. And I nearly died of the pain. My forehead began to swell up where she struck it. But she wouldn't let me off even after that. I continued to repeat the prayers, weeping as I did so. On that day, I thought to myself secretly that when I grew up I would pick up a stone and fling it at this sister. I also thought to myself that I would never attend a catechism class or go to a church service ever again. My anger abated a little with this thought. But before I grew up, that sister left our village and was transferred elsewhere. In this way, we went to Pasai every day in the morning, and to catechism and prayers in the evening. And in school, there were scripture lessons for the Christian children and moral education for the Hindu children. I always gained good marks at scripture. I even won prizes. When we went to school or to church we had to walk some distance, past several streets. The church, the school, the convent and the priest's bungalow were all in places where the upper caste communities lived. Most of the children attending the school were from our streets. All these children had to walk the distance there in order to study. There were few Christians among the upper castes. For them, the church, the school, the convent and the priest's house were all close at hand. There was no necessity for them to walk any distance. It was we who had to do that, through pouring rain and beating sun. What's more, often it was just the lights in our street that wouldn't work. Nobody would take any notice of this fact. In the darkness and the mire, you had to watch out for shit as you came and went. Perhaps the priests and the sisters chose to live elsewhere because of the filthy conditions here, I don't know. When I was studying in the school which the priests ran, from the 6th to the 8th class, they pulled down the old church and began work on a new one. So they began to dig the ground behind the old church in order to lay the new foundations. Some of us used to go there from our handwork class in order to shovel out the earth from the pits. One day, when I was there, I could make out a skeleton against the walls of the pit. 2 or 3 others saw it along with me, and we were all stunned with terror. Then another girl came along and told us a fascinating string of stories that this was the skeleton of a former priest who had been buried here. He had been canonized and was now a saint and in heaven. And not just that either. She added that because this was the skeleton of a priest, if we took it and kept it as a relic, it would enable us to study well. We'd be granted anything we prayed for, she said. And as she was telling us all this, she helped herself to 2 or 3 of the teeth. At once the rest of us helped ourselves to whatever we could take from the skeleton. Of course we left the bigger bones alone. Anyway, we couldn't carry those away. But we picked up all the little bones and teeth, and put them carefully into our geometry boxes. Every day we prayed to the teeth. I don't want to be beaten by teacher, I want to study well, I want to be clever. We prayed for all sorts of things like that. A few days went by. One evening all of us in my family were sitting together at home, studying and reading. The science teacher had asked us to make a couple of diagrams. As I was drawing them, my elder sister saw the teeth in my box and asked, "How did you get all these teeth, Dee? From where did you pick them up?" Immediately, my elder brother, my younger sister, my mother and Potty, all began asking me one question after another. So I told them all about it. They all laughed heartily. My mother and Potty told me emphatically that those were no priest's teeth, that the priests were never buried there, but that some time ago, a man who had worked in the priest's kitchen had died and was known to have been buried there. They said that in all likelihood those teeth were his, and that I must throw them out. But I didn't have the heart to do it. I had placed such devotion on those teeth. I even had some fear that it might be a sin if I threw them out. And in the end I didn't do it. It was Annan, my older brother, who took the lot and flung them on the rubbish heap. The next day when I went to school, I told the others all about it. And they too decided, fearfully, to fling their bones away. We took them and cast them away with a feeling of repulsion, exactly the opposite of the respect and devotion in which we had held them, and we ran home without once looking back. I have been caught up in blind belief such as this and come away from it. In those days, every evening there would be family prayers at home. As soon as we came home from church in the evening, there would be prayers at home. Hunger would tear at our insides. But my mother would say sternly that there would be food only after prayers. If there was something like fish or meat waiting, we could never concentrate on the prayer anyway. And sometimes we would insist obstinately that we had to eat first. If we said our prayers after dinner, though, everyone would fall asleep. Hence the rule that dinner always came after prayers. Even if the rest of us said our prayers only out of a sense of duty, my mother always covered her head properly and prayed in the most rapt and tender-hearted fashion. Whenever I think of my mother, it is this image of her, so often seen in my childhood, that appears before my eyes. After prayers, we sang hymns out of the hymn book. But whatever we sang, or did not, my mother never forgot to sing, "My heart, come. Let us worship, the Lord is everlasting bliss." When I was in the 6th class, our house was electrified. Until then, we only used kerosene oil lamps. When we first got electricity, we used to love switching the lights on and off. There were even quarrels about it at home. Even Potty would keep switching the lights on and off unnecessarily, and then laughing like a child. She would keep repeating, in wonder, "Just see what a magical thing this current is, which they've gone and discovered. As soon as I tap this thing, the current catches in a trice and lights the lamps." She was overjoyed because the current never ran out the way that oil did. In Potty's house there was just the head of a baby Jesus. It seems that the image of the baby Jesus fell down in the church and broke, and so they had thrown the pieces out. But Potty brought away just the head, very carefully, and kept it in her house. Whenever I went to her house, I would take the head and hold it in my lap and kiss it. I'd take it to the street and show it to all the children there, so that they too could kiss it. Potty would get really cross with me. She'd say that I would break it. Much later, when Potty lay in bed ill, my younger brother took it, painted it in crazy colors and turned it into a doll's head. He didn't have an urge to show it the respect and devotion that I did. In our house there were several pictures and icons of Jesus, Our Lady, Saint Joseph, Saint Anthony, Saint Sebastian, Saint Ignatius, Archangel Michael, the Holy Family and the Crucifixion. There were several versions of Our Lady in any case, different pictures of Our Lady of Perpetual Succor, Our Lady of Pundi, Our Lady of Velencani, Our Lady of Sorrows. Once our house was electrified, we had a plug put in next to the pictures, so that a bulb would light up beside them. But at that time, I didn't know much about electric plugs. I only knew how to switch on and off the lights. One day, as I was coming home from morning service, I stole a couple of hibiscus flowers from the garden of our teacher, whose house was just next to the church. If we were caught doing this, they would never let us go. So we used to climb onto the compound wall very stealthily and pick them. The flowers hung just over the wall. I wanted to bring the flowers and offer them to the picture of Jesus. But there was northwest convenient place to put them. Until my eyes fell on the plug. As there were 3 good holes in the plug, I began by tucking one of the flowers by its stem into the first hole. Immediately I felt a tingle pulling all along my arm. I couldn't understand why it had happened. Anyway, I then tucked the second flower into the next hole. Again I felt the tug along my arm. When this happened the second time, I realized it was the electric current pulling. At once I was frightened and I thought to myself, I'm done for now. God is allowing the current to tug at me like this because I stole the flowers and brought them here. Immediately I said a small prayer. Fearfully, I spoke out aloud and said I would never again steal flowers and bring them there like this. Then I climbed down and went away. I had such a certainty of belief in those days. There is a mountain adjacent to our village. It seems that long ago, Our Lady made an appearance there. Once long ago, the parish priest of this place set off by bullock cart to the nearby village to say Pasai there. In those days, they didn't have the buses that run now. So, as he was traveling by cart, it seems night fell. He was on a path through the forest at the time. Apparently the priest told the cartman to drive on anyway, because they had only a little further to go. After a particular point, they say the bullocks refused to move. The cartman did his best to lead the animals forward. But they simply would not go any further. However hard he tried to urge them on, they refused even to take a single step forward. At last the priest gave up, thinking to himself what a wretched hour it was for the beasts to be acting in so stubborn a manner, so they stopped right there, and the priest went to sleep inside the cart. It was a lonely place, with no sound nor trace of human beings. It was dense with trees. They heard the incessant buzz of bees. Both priest and cartman were terrified in their hearts. The priest fell asleep, repeating the rosary to himself. They say it came to midnight. The priest lay asleep and dreaming. In his dream the Mother of God appeared to him, and told him that he must build a church for her in that place. They say he woke up then and asked, "Mother, where should I build it?" And he saw her standing at a little distance from where the cart had stopped, in all her grace and beauty. Around her there shone such a dazzling light. The next instant, amazingly, she had disappeared. After that, it seems the priest could not sleep at all. He sat up until dawn broke, saying his rosary. At dawn, he woke up the cartman and asked him to go to the village where they were bound. And in the morning, the bullocks moved on in their customary way. He himself was surprised, they say. Then, it seems, the priest told the cartman all that had happened in the night. And they set about building a church there straight away. And my father too helped in the construction work as the church went up. This is how I've heard the older folk tell the story of the vision granted by Our Lady, and of how the church came to be built. That place is known as Chinnamalai, Little Mountain. On the first Friday of every month, there used to be a Pasai at Chinnamalai. We school children would get together and set off walking there on Thursday evening, with our packed meals. There was a distance of about 5 or 6 miles between our village and the mountain. Before we left, we'd ask them at home to give us a little spending money. On the way we'd buy muruku, ice candy, candy floss, jelly sweets, guava and cucumber, and we'd eat these things and chatter as we walked on. In the evening, there would be a rosary at the church. At the end of that, we'd sit down and eat some of the food that we had brought. We'd keep the rest for the next morning. Then we'd spread our cloths on the church floor and sleep right there. If it was the season for ripe tamarind, we'd roast the ripe pods in the flame of the lighted candles and eat them. Otherwise, we'd spit on a stone and grind down raw tamarind, scrape the paste off and lick it. It would make our tongues blister. But we wouldn't leave off even then. It used to be great fun to climb the banyan trees there, and swing ourselves by holding onto the aerial roots. It was a good place. We'd also play with each other, clambering up and down the rocks. There were mountains all about us. They were so beautiful. And the air always felt fresh, with a fine breeze blowing. The next morning we'd wake up, clean our teeth with red brick powder, wash our faces, and go to Pasai. Even while Pasai was being celebrated, some people would start arriving by the morning bus. We'd keep a lookout during Pasai and check on the people who were arriving. As soon as Pasai was over, we'd go over to the icon of the crucified Christ which was in a mountain cave nearby, singing the hymn, Sweet Sacred Heart of Jesus, all along the way, and say a prayer there. After we had put our offering in the collection box, we'd sit down to eat the rest of our packed rice. When we had finished, we'd pluck some leaves from the neem and tamarind trees to bring home in our tiffin carriers. All the older women used to do that. So we children used to do it too, in imitation of them. They said that these leaves were pure and holy leaves, they were good as medicine, too. If we kept them at home, we wouldn't get insect bites. If they were tucked above the entrance to the house, into the doorframe, no pay, pisasa nor ill wind would come near. After the Pasai was over, we would return home, walking all the way. By that time, the sun would be burning hot. We never wore chap-pals or anything of that sort. Even the dust would be scorching. We'd run a little, walk a little, sit under the shade for a while, and so at last we'd arrive home. The school usually gave us a holiday that day. Apart from going up the Chinnamalai every month, we also celebrated the Chinnamalai festival every year in the month of May. Many people from the villages roundabout came to the festival. The flag was raised 9 days before the festival, and the celebration took place on the 9th day in the evening, and on the 10th day. On the 9th day, from dawn, people would arrive in endless rows by bullock cart, or on foot, or in buses. And They would bring with them a rooster or a goat or a pig which would be slaughtered at the mountain, besides firewood, pots and pans, and all the ingredients that they needed for cooking. Chinnamalai at that time would be all animated, bustling with life. All around the church they would have set up canopies decorated with plantain trees, and lit up with tube lights. Heaven knows how the stallkeepers got wind of it, but they always turned up exactly 2 days ahead, cleared the ground and set up shop. The stalls were always set up in a row: flower stalls, bangle stalls, stalls selling fruit, stalls with icons and images, and stalls selling idli dosai and other snacks. There would also be a brisk petty trade in sweet toddy, palm fruit, tender coconut, vadai, ices, halwa, kesri and payasam. The press of the crowds would be unbearable. All the carts and bullocks would be tied together to one side. Those who managed to squeeze inside the church would pray there. The rest would go to sleep. Young men would wander about the shops wearing new clothes, their hair streaked down with oil. Young women too would be in new clothes, with flowers in their hair, all gossip and giggles. Older people would sit in the same place the whole day, pounding betel nut for chewing, keeping guard over the family's goods, and making sure that no one else was likely to take over their spot. From time to time, the babies lying in makeshift hammocks strung from pandal posts or branches of trees would mewl and scream. For some time nobody would hear them because of the noise all around. Only if they noticed the bouncing and tossing of the hammocks would the old women realize that the babies were crying. Then they would rock them to sleep again. Very early in the morning there would be a saparam procession of the holy images. Drummers, who had hardly slept at all, would walk ahead, beating on their drums, followed by a few men carrying petromax lamps. After that came the men carrying the icons. The procession went all around. Now and then they would let off crackers. Sometimes there would be firework displays as well. Only a few people followed on in the procession, though. 4 or 5 priests still waited in the confession boxes. But how was one to confess anything in the midst of all that noise? The priest couldn't hear what we said, nor could we hear what he told us to do. All the same, because I thought it was my duty to do so, I too would stand along with all the others in the queue, and make my confession when it was my turn. If not, my mother and Potty would scold me for not making my confession on such a holy day. So I always went along with them. On the previous evening, people would have brought out their packed rice, and perhaps bought some vadai to eat before they dropped off to sleep. In the morning there would be a pasai at the church. Even those who were half asleep would somehow stumble in and take communion at that hour. If they didn't take communion then, it would only be possible to do so at the 7 o'clock pasai at the grotto. If they decided to go to the 7 o'clock pasai, then they would not be able to cook in the early morning. So somehow they would push and shove and manage to attend the early pasai. At 7 o'clock, there was the pasai at the grotto. We called it Guga Pasai. The pasai would proceed steadily up above. Rising from the base of the mountain, people would be seated in colorful row upon row. I always found this a beautiful sight. In the grotto, right at the top, 2 or 3 priests said pasai in joint celebration. You had to be really smart to climb up and take communion there. It was so steep and slippery all the way up. Still, we'd manage it somehow. As soon as the Guga Pasai began, people here and there would put together their stone hearths and start their cooking. Soon there would be smoke clouds everywhere. It was piteous to hear the cries of the chicken and goat as they were slaughtered. Particularly it was the roosters that always seemed to make enough noise to awaken all the villages round about. Those who butchered calves or pigs would sell some of the meat to others. Those who hadn't brought their own firewood went around gathering twigs and thorny sticks. Some men would climb up trees and cut down withered old branches. By the time the rice was boiled, the kazambu cooked and taken off the fire, everyone would be ravenous. They used to spread out some straw, lay a damp cloth on top, spread the drained rice over that and let it cool. The smallest children, too hungry to wait, would scoop up the rice and eat it straight away. Between 10 and 11, everyone would sit down in rows and feast until they were ready to drop. Then, before everyone had quite finished eating, beggars and Narikaravan gypsies would crowd about us, scarcely allowing us to put food into our mouths. Once the feasting was over, one way or another, all the leftover rice, kazambu and curry would be divided up and given away as charity to all those who begged. Then, in the heat of the afternoon, the bullock carts would be yoked and we would arrive home at sunset time. All this still happens year after year. Yet it seems that the devotion to Our Lady is manifested chiefly in choosing and wearing new clothes, and feasting on a newly slaughtered chicken or goat. And so it goes on. I hear that in these days they brew toddy and liquor in the hills surrounding the church. People arrive drunk and start brawls and fights. Until I entered the convent, I too went to Chinnamalai every festival day and joined in the worship. As a small child, the extent of my piety lay in the pleasure of receiving new clothes, riding in the cart, eating snacks, enjoying the feast, and buying icons, bangles and toys. When I was a little older, it was still only the pleasure of wearing new clothes, and meeting my friends and sauntering about with them that drew me there. But when I developed some common sense and discrimination, it began to strike me that rather than jostle among the crowd in the name of the festival, I would much prefer to worship at home. After I joined the convent, I didn't get another opportunity to attend this particular festival. Nor did I think about it and regret it. In my village, they celebrated Easter in a grand manner. There usually was a house-to-house collection for the festival, and a grand celebration with procession and drums. But it was just us, the Dalit Christians, who contributed to the festival. The Nadars neither contributed, nor did they participate in the celebrations on that day. Before Easter itself, on Good Friday, there was a service throughout the day. When I was attending primary school, and then the convent school in our village, it was obligatory to attend the Good Friday service. One of the teachers would say the prayers out of a book, dragging it out into a chant. Sometimes it turned into a monotonous tune. Really, it used to send us all off to sleep. But as usual, one could not drop off to sleep quietly because of the sisters' vigilance. Sometimes the sisters themselves would nod off. But could we go and hit them? Or pinch them? We'd wear good clothes and put flowers in our hair to go the Easter midnight service. On that occasion, the Pasai was held in front of the church, outdoors. Everyone would he down and fall asleep there. The breeze blew through the neem trees and felt fresh and cool. At midnight, when Jesus rose from the dead, the sisters would wake everyone up, beating them with the mats they sat on. All the bells would ring out then, the big bell in the church tower as well as the small bells used during Pasai. One of the teachers would run up and remove the white cloth which covered the icon of the risen Lord all this time, and Jesus would stand in front of us, risen from the dead. We would all prostrate ourselves and worship him. As all the bells sounded and the risen Lord was revealed, I always felt a thrill running through me. It would seem to me that God had truly appeared to us from heaven. During Pasai they would tell us to light our candles or to put them out at various times. I wanted only to keep mine alight. But the sisters would not allow it. We had to blow them out. It was fun to make a small heap of earth, plant the candle in it, and play with the flame. The Pasai would proceed on its own course. The priest carried his own big Easter candle. No sooner was the Pasai over than everyone rushed forward carrying spoons and vessels. It most certainly would come to a fight at some point. We'd scoop up some of the new fire and the holy water as best as we could, and then go home. When we reached home, we had to drink some of the holy water with great devotion, and sprinkle the rest in different places throughout our house. We would place the new fire in the hearth. When we woke up in the morning and made the breakfast idlis, it was that fire that was used to light the cooking stove. Throughout that day we'd cook and eat good meals. That evening we'd set off from our streets, clapping our hands and beating drums, all the way to the church. There would be a blessing there. As soon as that was over, the older women would gather in a circle and dance a kumi, singing a hymn which began, "He is coming through our street, Yesu is coming in his chariot." We'd all gather round to watch the fun. The men would play chadagudu. Later at sunset time, the icon of the risen Lord would be placed in the carrying chariot, decorated, blessed by the priest, and taken in procession through the village. For some reason the Nadar community would never join in any of this. They never made any contribution towards the festival. They never came forward to decorate the chariot, nor did they offer to carry it. When the procession went along their street, they only peeped at it as the Hindus did, and stayed inside their houses. The procession went along the streets of different communities and castes. All along the way we'd follow singing Christian hymns and saying prayers. We'd go all the way as far as the bazaar, and go home only after that to sleep. Only then was Easter over. But I understood what an important event Easter is for us, only after I had left home, and gone to study elsewhere. It was only then that I became fully aware of its significance. Christmas was over for us with the end of the midnight Pasai. It used to be very hard for me to wake up and go to the midnight service at Christmas and Easter. Sometimes, at the very thought of rousing myself from sleep, I would complain, why did this Jesus choose to be born and to rise from the dead at the midnight hour? As a child I preferred Christmas to Easter. Because we were given new clothes at Christmas. But not at Easter. Christmas ended with a customary festive meal of beef. New Year's Day too was like that. Nowadays, though, the celebration of these festival days is gradually changing. Of course, the change is in keeping with our changing times. But nobody seems to reflect any more on why we celebrate these things. The sisters and the priests too don't say what needs to be said, but only speak words which are irrelevant, meaningless mumbo-jumbo. Because of all this, these celebrations no longer have any significance for me. What passes for devotion nowadays is merely a matter of doing things out of a sense of duty. When I finished schooling in my village and joined the convent boarding school to study in the 9th class, the fear, Bama, that I felt towards God gradually left me, and love, Pasam, grew. I tried to the best of my ability to pray at all times, to go to Jesus, look at him, and talk to him frequently, not to behave in a way that would cause him pain, not to commit sinful deeds, to be good. There used to be a 3-day retreat every year. I loved it. It was at that time that I began to do such things as going to Pasai every day, receiving communion, and making a weekly confession with a loving and accepting mind. I really liked the sisters there. I had a deeply held wish in my heart to become a nun like them and give myself to God. When I finished my exams after the 10th class, I told one of the sisters about my wish. But she told me that I should only consider it after I had finished my college education. With difficulty I admitted myself into college. But it was during the time I was studying there that the love and devotion that I felt towards God gradually diminished. Of course, in times of trouble, I thought to myself, God help me, but that was all. Everything became a matter of routine drudgery. All sorts of questions beset my mind, such as, why should I go to Pasai every day? Why should I take communion? I began to think that the priests and nuns had deceived me hugely. Up to that time I had thought that God came to me through these people, but this belief changed to the extent that I now began to feel strongly that God was not with them. And so, I began to dislike everything they did. I began to question them. I argued and fought. I thought to myself with some disgust, Che, they are all hypocrites and frauds. I felt in my heart that I could go and speak directly to God without their intervention. I could no longer believe that God could only be reached, as they had taught us, through prayer learned by rote, through pious practices, through the novena and the rosary. I came to realize that you could see God through the mind's eye in nature, and in the ordinary events of every day. So all the rituals that I had followed and believed in so far suddenly began to seem meaningless and just a sham. The desire to become a nun fell away from me entirely at this time. I finished my education and started to work. By chance I took up a post at a school run by nuns. At the start, when I met them, I thought they would be different in their ways. But as time went on, I realized they were truly like whited sepulchres, as Jesus said. Until I quite realized this, I was even tempted to enter their order and to become one of them. Fortunately, I didn't do so. I worked there for 5 years. All the children who attended that school were from poor families. About 3/4 of them were from Dalit families. I liked teaching them. I was happy in my fashion. But when I observed some of the atrocities that were going on, I would be ablaze with fury. They could have done so much for those poor children. Instead, they ate and lived in comfort and argued amongst themselves. They ran a boarding school which was nominally for the sake of destitute children, but in fact they made those children do every menial task that was needed. They behaved as if they were the queens there, and everybody else was there only to run errands for them. The few nuns who were even slightly humane had a difficult time. And even amongst themselves. There were caste divisions between the rich and the poor, and even divisions over the languages that they spoke. Besides the usual lessons, they could have educated the Dalit children in many matters, and made them aware of their situation in the world about them. But instead, everything they said to the children, everything in the manner in which they directed them suggested that this was the way it was meant to be for Dalits, that there was no possibility of change. And mainly because of this, those children seemed to accept everything as their fate. As I saw all this, I became very troubled in my mind. I was angry. I thought to myself, what sort of nuns are these? They claim that they are helping the poor and the needy, yet this is how they are. At times I confronted them and argued with them. Yet, even though I observed these nuns and their way of life, from time to time I was still seized with a wish to enter an order. I wanted to become a nun, but to be different. I felt a yearning to treat these children as all children ought to be treated, to look after them rather than torment and exploit them. At the same time, I kept on telling myself obstinately that I ought not ever to enter a convent. I continued to cherish in my heart a certain love and devotion towards Jesus and Our Lady. But I found what the nuns and priests said distasteful. Occasionally, when a priest from other parts came and addressed us about our society and about the needs of our people, I would feel an eagerness within me. And it was during those days that I was suddenly seized by a desire to read the Bible through, at least once. So morning and evening, I read my way through the Old Testament and the New Testament. I learned that God has always shown the greatest compassion for the oppressed. And Jesus, too, associated himself mainly with the poor. Yet nobody had stressed this nor pointed it out. All those people who had taught us only that God is loving, kind, gentle, one who forgives sinners, patient, tender, humble, obedient. Nobody had ever insisted that God is just, righteous, is angered by injustices, opposes falsehood, never countenances inequality. There is a great deal of difference between this Jesus and the Jesus who is made known through daily pieties. The oppressed are not taught about him, but rather are taught in an empty and meaningless way about humility, obedience, patience, gentleness. I truly don't know what happened to me, in spite of all my criticism of the nuns. More and more the thought grew in my mind that I should become a nun, and teach those who suffer that there is a Jesus who cares, to put heart into them and to urge them onwards. At the same time, I also was aware that even if I became a nun, I might never be allowed to act in this way. All the same, however hard I pushed it away, the idea grew stronger. Sometimes I was even embarrassed that I should harbor such a notion after all these years of castigating and reproaching the nuns. When I discussed my plan at home, and with my close friends, not one of them supported me. Everyone thought I was joking. I wasn't being serious. I myself wished I could be free of the notion. But the more I hoped to be free of it, the greater grew the urge to enter an order. So, in spite of all the people who advised me against it, in spite of some of them downright forbidding me to do it, I resigned my job and prepared to enter a religious order. Today I realize what an extremely foolish thing I did. But at that time I didn't understand the blindest bit of what I was doing. I was like one who was falling into a well, blindfolded. In the end I was disappointed by the order that I entered. But to begin with, the first 3 years were not quite like that. To some extent at least we read and studied about people's hardships and suffering, and about the human attributes of Jesus. We discussed these things. We thought with some urgency about what we ought to do, and how we should do it. Time passed, full of the bright imagined hope of what we might achieve after we became nuns. We read about the woman who founded our order. It was good to learn of her love and concern for the poor, and of how she lived and died for their sake. I felt an unshakable desire to be like her, to suffer for the sake of the poor then and in the future. At that time, all my prayers, my meditation and my thoughts were directed towards oppressed and exploited people, and towards the Jesus who fought for justice and fairness. It seemed to me it was meaningless to repeat prayers in beautiful and decorative language, and to live without that correspondence and connection between prayer, worship and life. I talked to others about my convictions. When there did not seem to be this connection, I asked why it wasn't there. We should never believe one thing and do another. We should speak up about what we believe. That is being true to oneself. Everything else is play acting. I never cared to survive by acting out a role. I made my first vows with many hopes and thoughts in my heart. I dreamt that I would share my life with the poor and the suffering, live and die for them. Instead, I was sent to a prestigious school and asked to teach there. It was only after I arrived there that it all became clear to me. All the children there came from wealthy families. The convent too was a well-endowed one. And the Jesus they worshipped, there was a wealthy Jesus. There seemed to be no connection between God and the suffering poor. Neither the prayers that were said morning and night, nor the daily Pasai, showed any evidence of that connection. I couldn't make it out at all. I found I had to search hard to find God. There was no love to be found in that convent, among these people who declared all the time that God is loving. There was no love for the poor and the humble. They claimed that God's love is limitless, subject to no conditions. Yet inside the convent there were innumerable conditions about how you should be and who you were in order to deserve their love. When outsiders arrived, flaunting their wealth and education, they were treated with one sort of love. If they did not have these things, they were treated in quite a different way, and I am not sure there was any love at all in this case. They shout themselves hoarse that God is just, they sing to this effect in their hymns. But it is injustice that dances like a demon in the convents and within all the institutions that are run by these people. They say with melting hearts, our God is a forgiving God. But if you look within, they seem to go about always saying, who is it, when and what is it, hit him, punish him. Their very words are barbed, like arrows. Nobody who gets in the way of their own convenience is let off easily. With such an ecstasy of devotion they claim in church that God was born into a poor family, lived among the poor, and died poor. But if by accident a poor and lowly person appears within the precincts of the convent or the school, they'll fall upon that person, like rabid dogs. On such occasions, I would remember the line, it is a sin to treat someone according to their outward appearance. But then, they have used this very line often enough for their hour-long and special meditations. In the same way, they hold wonderful expositions on the words of Jesus, that we should take no thought of what we eat or drink. But this is all inside the church and at church meetings. Elsewhere they will discuss for hours about what we should eat today, and what we should eat tomorrow, what we should wear. I became completely confused in my head about the place of belief and devotion in all this. There seemed to be one God within the church and another outside. I was extremely bewildered by all these different versions of God. But they seem to have no problem either with creating these different versions, or with juggling smartly between all of them. You have to admit, it takes a kind of skill. Either they should come out with it and say, yes, ours is a God who serves the rich, we follow him, and worship him alone, and live openly like that. Otherwise they must say ours is a God of the poor, who chose to be born in a cattle shed, we too are like him, and then try to live in that way. But there is something ugly in saying one thing, and doing another. How long can one play act in this way? Anyway, it wasn't possible for me. I had to leave the order and come into the world. And I don't know if they have become so habituated to their play acting that they can no longer distinguish between the role and the reality. Nowadays, now that I have left the order, I am angry when I see priests and nuns. Until I actually entered the convent, I truly did not understand their approach nor any of their procedures. It was only after my sojourn with them that I understood the lack of humanity in their piety. They speak in an empty way of devotion, renunciation, the Holy Spirit, God's vocation, poverty, chastity and obedience. They lead lives which remind me only of the Pharisees, Sadducees and high priests who appear in the Bible. If Jesus were to appear today, he would question them much more sharply and severely than he did before. And even if he were to do so, I am not sure whether they will understand. When I look at the church today, it seems to be a church made up of the priests and nuns and their kith and kin. And when you consider who they are, it is clear that they are all from upper castes. They are the ones who are in the positions of power. Yet when you consider the Christian people as a whole, most of them are lowly people and Dalits. These few assume power, control the dispossessed and the poor by thrusting a blind belief and devotion upon them and by turning them into slaves in the name of God, while they themselves live in comfort. In the name of God they actually rob from the poor who struggle for their very livelihood. They teach them to shut their eyes when they pray with the deliberate intention that they should not open their eyes and see. They teach them to shackle their arms together and to prostrate themselves in prayer at full length on the ground so that they should never stand tall. What kind of piety can this be? They make themselves into gods so that they can exploit others. So where has God gone? The so-called gods walking about here are the priests and nuns and their relations, no other. How long will they deceive us, as if we are innocent children, with their Pasai and their Holy Communion, their Rosary and their Novena? Children, growing up, will no longer listen to everything they are told, open-mouthed, nodding their heads. Dalits have begun to realize the truth. They have realized that they have been maintained as the stone steps that others have trodden on as they raise themselves up. They have become aware that they have been made slaves in the name of God, the Pasai and the Church. They have experienced a state of affairs where, in the name of serving the poor, these others have risen in power while actually treading on the poor. Dalits have learnt that these others have never respected them as human beings, but bent the religion to their benefit, to maintain their own falsehoods. But Dalits have also understood that God is not like this, has not spoken like this. They have become aware that they too were created in the likeness of God. There is a new strength within them, urging them to reclaim that likeness which has been so far repressed, ruined, obliterated, and to begin to live again with honor, self-respect, and with a love towards all humankind. To my mind, this alone is true devotion.